Colton lived with only his grandmother in a small country. His mom died at birth and he didn't know anything about his dad. It was just him and his grandmother. Due to old age, Colton's grandmother couldn't do any work to provide for them, so since a very young age, Colton sold salt every day to put food on their table. Sometimes he couldn't get to sell enough to afford food, so he would resort to pickpocketing some wealthy people in the town and also steal some foodstuffs from their storages. Colton loved reading and learning, but couldn't afford the luxury of going to school. He takes a break from selling salt by sneaking into the school of the wealthy people in the country to hide by a window of a class outside to listen and learn what they are being taught. That was his favorite time of the day. Colton chose to sneak into the school for the wealthy because their teaching and learning was advanced, which excites him, unlike the school for the commoners, where they only taught basic things, which Colton found boring. One day, while hiding by the window and attentively listening to a class, a boy his age appeared behind him and asked, "What are you doing here?" Colton got startled and immediately ran away. The boy was Prince Apollo, the only male child of the royal family and the heir to the kingdom. He had often seen Colton at the window and found him interesting. The next day, Apollo was excited to see Colton again. He approached him, and Colton was about to run, but Apollo stopped him and said, "I just want us to be friends." Colton thought for a moment. He had never had friends, as he was always busy searching for daily bread. Having a friend, especially a wealthy one, wouldn't be bad. Colton agreed to be friends and introduced himself. Apollo couldn't risk revealing his real name, as everyone treated him with caution due to his royal status. Luckily, Colton didn't recognize him, but he might if Apollo said his true name, as he was the only one with that name in the entire country. Apollo introduced himself as Peter. Apollo moved his seat to the window side in class so he could secretly communicate with Colton while class was ongoing. He always waited and ate his lunch with Colton and played together a little before making an excuse to leave when he saw his guards approaching to pick him up from school. The two grew quite close within a short period of time. They grew so close that Colton even felt comfortable enough to tell Apollo about how he had to steal sometimes so he and his grandmother could eat a day's meal. Apollo didn't judge him and even brought him some food stuff every day, and some clothes and shoes. Colton always felt his age, happy and relaxed whenever he was with Apollo. He had to mature starting at a very young age, and had never felt genuinely happy. One day, as Apollo was teaching Colton something they had learned in class, which Colton didn't quite understand, a boy from Apollo's class saw them and went up to them and bowed to Apollo, addressing him as "Your Highness." Colton laughed, thinking it was a joke, but the boy glanced at Colton with disdain and asked Apollo, "Is this peasant bothering you?" Colton stopped laughing, realizing it wasn't a joke. Apollo replied to the boy, "You are the one bothering us, and he is my friend, not a peasant." He then ordered the boy to leave, and the boy bowed and left. Colton stared at Apollo, waiting for him to at least deny that he wasn't who he was thinking he is, but Apollo was also staring at him with a guilty face, not saying anything. Colton asked, "Who really are you?" and Apollo spilled that he was the prince. Colton was shocked and immediately got up and ran from there. He couldn't believe that the person he had been sharing all his life happenings to and playing around casually with turned out to be the prince. What will happen to him if he ratted him out about him stealing and got him arrested? Who would take care of his grandmother? On the other hand, Apollo was sad that the only friend he had managed to get probably wouldn't want to be friends with him anymore. For days, Apollo waited for Colton at their spot, but he never showed up. He didn't know where Colton lived, and he couldn't ask anyone for help because, as the prince, he wasn't allowed to be friends with commoners who didn't have any value. His life was now back to being monotonous and boring with no actual friends. Colton usually sneaked into the kingdom to pick up the leftover foodstuffs that were thrown away every month, even though most of them were perfectly fine. It was that time of the month, and Colton was contemplating whether to go or not because he didn't want to bump into Apollo. But then again, he had never seen him around since all the previous months he had been sneaking in, so it had to be safe to go. He successfully snuck into the place where everything was disposed of, and was picking up every good thing he could find, when he saw Apollo come out of a wall that had opened like a door. Colton was so amazed that he forgot he had to hide. Apollo saw him, and at that time, a guard was also approaching. Apollo quickly went and pulled Colton with him to the wall he had just come out from. Colton had forgotten about Apollo's status and was just admiring the secret passage in awe. That place was a secret passage to Apollo's room, which only Apollo knew about. Since he wasn't allowed out of the kingdom without a million guards following him around, he used this passage to sneak out, since it was his easy sneaking out from there. Apollo walked Colton to his room, with Colton just looking around, not even noticing where Apollo was taking him to. When they got to Apollo's room, that was when Colton actually came to his senses about who he was with. The two boys were just staring at each other awkwardly, Colton not knowing how to address Apollo. Now, Apollo broke the silence by apologizing to Colton for lying about his identity and explaining that he only lied because he just needed a genuine friend who wouldn't always act cautious around him, and that he enjoyed every moment they spent together. Colton realized that Apollo was just a lonely kid like him, and agreed to still be friends. They both smiled and hugged each other. Apollo showed Colton his collection of books because he knew how much Colton loved books. They were all books Colton has been wanting to read for a long time. He took one and comfortably laid on his back on Apollo's huge-sized bed. Apollo also took one and laid in the bed, resting his head on Colton's stomach. Colton was totally absorbed in reading the book and asking Apollo questions about it. Apollo wasn't engrossed in his own book because he had already read it before. Before they knew it, it was already dark outside. Colton panicked when he realized how late it was, as he had never left his grandmother alone for so long. He told Apollo he had to go, and Apollo asked if he would see him the next day. Colton nodded before hurrying away. The foodstuffs he had packed were no longer there when he went out, so he left with nothing. Luckily, they had some leftovers at home, so he quickly prepared a meal for himself and his grandmother as soon as he arrived. In the following days, Colton and Apollo spent every day together in Apollo's room. Apollo would sneak food and other things from the palace storage rooms for Colton to take home. They grew more closer, and no one knew about their secret friendship. Colton was grateful for Apollo's presence in his life, as he had helped him a lot. Years passed, and their friendship remained strong. When Colton turned 17, his grandmother unfortunately passed away, leaving him alone with no other family. For weeks after her passing, Colton was in a state consumed by grief, just lying in bed. Apollo would sneak out daily to Colton's house, making sure he ate and cleaned himself. Then, he would join Colton in bed, holding him tightly, patting his back, and offering comfort, without saying anything. Colton finally got back on his feet. He realized he couldn't keep selling salt forever and keep relying on Apollo, so he tried finding a job, any good-paying job he could find. No one wanted to hire him because he had no educational background. Only those with an educational background could secure decent jobs. The other available jobs barely paid enough for a meal. Colton shifted his focus to finding a job at the palace. Being a guard was one of the highest-paying jobs in the country, depending on the type of guard you were. However, it required education and a minimum age of 18, which Colton hadn't yet reached. The only available option was a cleaning servant role, which paid better than what commoners offered. Colton accepted the job and moved to the servant quarters within the palace. The servant quarters were close to the secret passage to Apollo's room, so he could easily sneak in when his work was done. They had to pretend they didn't know each other when others were around. Everything was going well with working and then hanging out with Apollo in his free time, until Colton suddenly started feeling embarrassed whenever he had to work around Apollo. He felt uncomfortable with Apollo seeing him in his lowly state, especially when Apollo's sisters would order him around and Apollo would try to intervene. Apollo had 4 sisters and, except for Princess Iris, the others were rude and obnoxious. Apollo was only close to Iris, but she didn't know of his friendship with Colton. Colton had always been comfortable with Apollo, sharing his struggles, but now, he felt ashamed and even stopped accepting things from Apollo. He even avoided bumping into him while working. Apollo noticed the change and asked if something was bothering Colton, but he denied it. Colton himself was unsure of what was happening to him. On Apollo's 18th birthday, a grand party was held. Colton and Apollo had a tradition of celebrating each other's birthdays together with a little cake in Apollo's room since they both had it in the same month. This year wasn't different. They both planned to meet and celebrate the birthday in their own way after the party. However, after the party, there was a lot of mess made, so Colton and the other cleaners had a lot of cleaning to do. Apollo told Colton that he was going to wait for him. It was almost 4 a.m. when Colton finished with his work. He passed by the secret passage and contemplated whether to go to Apollo or not, as he might be asleep by that time. He went in to check anyway, and saw Apollo sitting on the bed, trying so hard not to sleep. Apollo was now completely awake the moment he saw Colton, and Colton said, "I thought you'd be sleeping." Apollo replied, "I promised I would wait for you," while lighting up a candle on their little cake. They both held the cake and sang the birthday song. They made a wish and blew the candle. Their faces were just inches apart as they moved to blow the candle. They both paused, staring at each other. They slowly moved, and before they knew it, they were kissing. The slowly parted lips, not breaking eye contact. Colton then said in that moment, "I think we should go to bed." Apollo exclaimed, "Huh?" And Colton quickly clarified, "I mean you should go to sleep on your own bed, and I'll go sleep on my own bed." Apollo then said, yeah, good night, or good morning." Colton smiled awkwardly saying, "Sweet dreams," and left. In the following days, Colton and Apollo acted normally as if nothing had happened between them. However, they couldn't shake off the tension and awkwardness that had developed. They tried to ignore it, but it was clear that things were no longer the same. As the only male child of the royal family, Apollo was destined to become the next king. Before his coronation, to be officially named the crown prince, he had to choose a bride from among some noble ladies who would compete for his attention and the queen's favor. Now that Apollo had turned 18, the time had come, and he couldn't escape it. During the contest, the ladies showcased their talents, but Apollo's eyes were fixed on Colton, who was cleaning on the other side of the room. After the first contest, Apollo left for his room, making it clear he wasn't interested in any of the ladies. Fortunately, he didn't have to make a choice yet. Colton met Apollo in his room and remarked, "There were many beautiful ladies out there. Which one caught your eye?" Apollo replied in a soft, calm tone, "No one. For some reason, I couldn't get my eyes off you the entire time." Colton tried to take it as a joke, awkwardly laughing it off, then said, "You should focus on those beautiful ladies next time." Apollo replied, "I don't want to. You know things haven't been the same between us since that day we kissed. There hasn't been a day since then that I haven't thought about it. I think I'm in love with you." Colton stared at Apollo, trying to process what he had just heard, then said, "You can't be in love with me. We are both men." Apollo replied in a calm, frustrated voice, "I know, but this feeling is too much for me to control." Colton quipped, "I have nothing to offer you," and Apollo answered, "I don't need anything from you. All I want is this," pointing his finger to Colton's heart. Colton held onto Apollo's finger, bringing it down, saying, "You know, any kind of relationship between us is impossible. We've had to hide just our friendship for years, and now this?" Apollo wrapped his arms around Colton's waist and rested his forehead on Colton's shoulder, saying, "Can't we just be selfish and not think of anything or anyone else?" Colton held Apollo's face and pulled it gently from his shoulder, saying, "You know that's not possible. You are the future king." Apollo sighed, then said, "Can you at least tell me how you feel about me? Do you still see me as just a friend?" Colton stood there, silent. He knew the answer in his heart. He knew he had also fallen in love with Apollo, but he also knew accepting it wasn't going to change anything. Apollo waited for Colton's answer, but Colton made an excuse. "I have to go. I've been gone for long. I'm sure they are already looking for me," then left. In the following days, the contest for choosing a bride continued, and Colton avoided the area, switching shifts with a co-worker if assigned to work there. Apollo also became busy with ceremonies and classes preparing him for his future role as king, and they hardly saw each other. Colton no longer visited Apollo's room as he used to. Since Apollo showed disinterest in the bride selection, the queen took charge, helping choose a suitable bride for her son. The ladies were narrowed down to 2, and it was time for Apollo to make his choice. The night before, Apollo visited the servant headquarters, knocking on Colton's door. He knew Colton's room, but had never been there, as Colton had always been cautious about their friendship being discovered. Colton was shocked to see Apollo when he opened the door, whispering, "What are you doing here?" He looked around nervously before pulling Apollo inside. Apollo began speaking, but Colton quickly covered his mouth, whispering that the walls were thin and everyone could hear even a tissue fall from their rooms. Luckily, everyone was asleep. Colton checked outside for any signs of anyone, then took Apollo's hand, leading him through their secret passage to Apollo's room. Colton realized he was still holding Apollo's hand and quickly let go, asking Apollo what he wanted to say earlier. Apollo replied, "I have to choose a bride tomorrow." Colton forced a smile and said, "Congratulations." Apollo asked, "Do you really want me to? Do you really not feel anything for me?" Colton replied, "We are friends, aren't we?" Apollo pressed on, "I'm sorry if you think I'm forcing my feelings on you, but I really want to know your true feelings. You are not denying or accepting that you love me too." Colton remained silent. Apollo moved closer to Colton, leaning in to kiss him, but Colton blocked his lips and said, "I can't do this." He turned to leave, but Apollo said, "If you walk out now, I'll assume you don't feel the same way. I don't think I can go back to being just friends with you." Colton paused, then sighed heavily. He turned back and said, "I love you too, okay? But that's not going to change anything. It's only going to hurt us, knowing we love each other but can't be together." Apollo hugged Colton tightly and said, "As long as we are together, we can overcome every obstacle." Colton asked, "How?" Apollo replied, "I don't know. All I know is that I will do anything for you. Let's just enjoy the moment and not think about the future." Colton hugged Apollo back and kissed the top of his head. Apollo said, "I love you." He waited for a response, but Colton remained silent. Apollo pulled back, staring at Colton. Finally, Colton smiled lightly and said, "I love you too." Apollo hugged Colton again and asked, "Can you stay with me for the night? I don't want to be alone tonight." Colton thought about how he would explain his absence from his room in the morning, but before he could respond, Apollo added, "I understand if you can't." Colton quickly agreed, "I'll just wake up early," and walked to the bed, climbing in. Apollo smiled, joined him in bed. Colton brought out his arms as Apollo was about to rest his head on a pillow, making his arms a pillow instead. As Apollo rested his head on Colton's arm, he wrapped his remaining arm around his neck, turning to hug him, but their faces met. Their gazes shifted from each other's eyes to their lips. Apollo contemplated leaning in to kiss or not, remembering the earlier rejection, but then saw Colton leaning in and couldn't resist, leaning in to kiss him too. Their lips met in a tender and passionate kiss. After parting lips, Apollo hugged Colton tightly, and Colton kissed his forehead. They both drifted off to sleep, wrapped in each other's arms. The next morning, when Apollo opened his eyes, Colton was not beside him. He had hoped to see Colton's face first thing, but Colton had already left. Apollo knew he had to face the day he had been dreading, but he had made up his mind not to choose a bride. As the remaining two ladies began their performance, Apollo sat unmoved. Just then, Colton appeared on the other side, and Apollo's gaze met his, bringing a smile to his face. One of the ladies, Rebecca, noticed Apollo's distraction and wondered who he was staring at, but she couldn't turn to look as she was mid-performance. She had dreamed of marrying Prince Apollo since childhood and had trained all her life to become his perfect wife. Confident that she had won the queen's favor, she expected to be chosen as Apollo's bride. When the contest ended and Apollo was asked to choose, he announced that he wasn't interested in anyone and didn't want to get married. The room murmured in shock, and the queen and king glared at Apollo, urging him to choose a lady. Desperate to escape the situation, Apollo stood up and walked away, leaving the room in an even greater uproar. For damage control, the queen announced that she would choose a bride for Apollo. Rebecca smirked, knowing she was the obvious choice. Indeed, the queen chose her. Meanwhile, Colton went to meet Apollo after seeing him walk away. Colton asked if there wasn't going to be any problem for the scene he just caused, and Apollo replied that he doesn't know. He just did what he felt like doing at that moment. This was his first time defying his parents, so he expected some long lectures later. Just then, someone knocked on Apollo's door. Colton quickly hid in a wardrobe as Apollo opened the door to find Rebecca standing there. Apollo asked, "Who are you?" Rebecca replied, "Your fiancé." Apollo said, "I don't remember being engaged to anyone." Rebecca responded, "Don't you recognize me? I was right in front of you minutes ago. Since you were having a hard time choosing a bride, your mother helped you choose, and she chose me." She walked into Apollo's room, looking around as if searching for someone. Apollo asked sternly, "Who gave you permission to enter my room?" Rebecca faked an apology before leaving, still glancing around the room. As soon as Rebecca left, Apollo shut the door and quickly went to get Colton, who was still hiding in the wardrobe. Apollo's sadness deepened, realizing that Colton had to hide constantly. The moment Colton came out, Apollo hugged him and said, "I'm sorry." Colton asked what he was apologizing for, but Apollo remained silent. Apollo faced a lengthy lecture and scolding from his parents, but it didn't bother him. He was forced to spend time with Rebecca, but whenever they were scheduled to meet, he would ditch her and spend time with Colton instead. Even when he couldn't be with Colton, he would still avoid Rebecca and just stay in his room to read books. Rebecca grew suspicious and began observing Apollo and Colton, noticing their frequent interactions. She even discovered their secret passage. She put pieces together and realized Colton might be the one Apollo had his eyes on and smiling at the entire time during the contest. One day, Rebecca confronted Colton and asked, "What's going on between you and the prince?" Colton replied, "What could possibly be going on between us?" Rebecca pressed on, "You tell me. If there's anything going on between you two, just know that it's temporary, because in the end, I'm the one he's going to marry." Just then, Princess Iris appeared and remarked, "Who's the one harassing my worker?" Rebecca quickly switched to a fake smile, bowed to Iris, and said she was just having a harmless conversation with Colton. Colton discreetly rolled his eyes at her lie. Iris asked Rebecca to leave and said she wanted to talk to Colton. After Rebecca departed, Iris turned to Colton and said, "Apollo told me everything about you both. I've been wondering who was making my brother happy all these years. It was you. Thank you for coming into his life." Colton replied, "I should be thanking him instead." Iris smiled and said, "I hope you both stay together forever." Colton shared, "I hope so too." Meetings between Colton and Apollo had become difficult because Rebecca was always around, watching them. They couldn't even use their secret passage anymore. Fortunately, Iris helped them evade Rebecca most times. Rebecca realized that as long as Colton was around, she and Apollo might never be together. She devised a plan to get rid of Colton. When she was chosen as Apollo's bride, she was given a royal heirloom ring, passed down through generations, by the queen. One day, she called Colton to talk and secretly slipped the ring into his pocket when he wasn't looking. Then, she went to the queen, claiming she had lost her ring. When asked where she last saw it, she said she was wearing it until she finished talking with Colton. She added, "Maybe I dropped it somewhere. I don't think he would steal it, but I'm not sure. I heard he used to steal a lot, but I guess people change, and he must be a changed person now." The queen, angry, immediately ordered some guards to search Colton's room. Colton was shocked and confused when guards burst into his room, searching everything and scattering his belongings. Rebecca watched with a secret smile. When the guards found nothing, Rebecca suggested searching Colton's clothes. They did, and the ring was found. Colton was immediately arrested and taken to the royal prison, still confused and unaware of what was happening. When he finally realized what was going on, he tried to protest, claiming he didn't steal the ring, but no one listened. 2 days passed, and Apollo hadn't seen Colton. He was worried and had no idea that Colton had been arrested until he overheard some maids talking about how Colton had been accused of stealing a royal heirloom. Apollo rushed to the royal prison and found Colton in a cell, confused and concerned. "What are you doing here?" Apollo asked. Colton replied, "I don't know. I think I'm being framed." Apollo tried to secure Colton's release, but the guards only took orders from the king and queen. Apollo wanted to go ask his parents to release Colton, risking them finding out about their friendship. Colton stopped him, but Apollo went anyway. They refused to listen, telling Apollo to focus on his upcoming coronation instead. Apollo visited Colton daily, bringing him good food and water, and assuring him that he would get him out. 2 weeks passed, and Rebecca appeared at Colton's cell, holding the keys and with no guards in sight. Colton confronted her, and she shamelessly admitted to framing him. Colton had heard of an ongoing school program in the country nearby and wanted to go, but didn't know how to tell Apollo. He felt this was his chance to leave, or he might never gather the courage again. He wanted to be more than just a cleaning servant and prove himself worthy in Apollo's eyes. Colton proposed to Rebecca, "If you let me out, I'll leave and disappear from Apollo's life." Rebecca was surprised, having considered the same proposal but not expecting Colton to suggest it. She skeptically stared at him, asking, "How can I trust you?" Colton replied, "You can choose to believe me or not." Rebecca thought for a moment, then said, "Keep your word," while opening the cell door. As Colton left, he said to Rebecca, "No matter how hard you try, Apollo will never love you." He then departed, carefully avoiding guards and anyone else, as he now knew every corner of the palace. He didn't visit Apollo, knowing that if he did, he might not be able to leave. Instead, he chose to quietly leave the country. Apollo came to visit Colton, only to find his cell empty. He asked the prison guards where Colton was, and they told him that he had escaped and they were still searching for him. Apollo quickly left to Colton's old house, but he wasn't there. Apollo's heart sank as he returned to the palace, wondering where Colton could be. For weeks, Apollo visited Colton's old house daily, hoping to see him, but he never did. He found himself crying when he saw things that reminded him of Colton. Was Colton abandoning him, or did something happen to him? These thoughts ran through Apollo's mind every day. With Colton gone, Apollo felt a part of him was missing, and he couldn't get used to life without him. One day, Apollo received a letter that carried Colton's familiar scent. He hastily opened it, and found that it was indeed from Colton. The letter explained how he had moved to a different country and schooling. Colton apologized for his sudden disappearance and asked Apollo not to hate him. Apollo's tears fell onto the letter as he read it, filled with mixed emotions. He was relieved that Colton was safe, but he also felt abandoned and hurt that Colton had left without a word. 4 years passed, and a lot had happened. Rebecca became pregnant by her ex-lover. She was craving physical intimacy, but Apollo wouldn't even look at her. Desperate, Rebecca gave in to her ex-lover's advances and slept with him. She considered terminating it, but decided to use it to her advantage, hoping to convince Apollo the child was his. Rebecca drugged Apollo, attempting to seduce him, but even in his drugged state, he kept mentioning Colton's name and refused her advances. Frustrated, she just undressed and lay beside him, hoping to deceive him that something happened between them. However, Apollo remembered everything and knew nothing happened between them. The truth about Rebecca's pregnancy came to light, and she was thrown out. Apollo threw himself into his royal duties, using work as a distraction from thoughts of Colton that haunted him daily. Colton completed his education and became a primary school teacher, also providing free education to underprivileged children, reminiscent of his own struggles. He wrote multiple letters to Apollo, each intended to be read every day for 6 months, before sending another when possible, because mails could only be sent once every 6 months. However, Apollo never replied. Colton stopped sending letters when he heard Rebecca was pregnant. He thought Apollo was probably now doing okay without him, and he didn't want to bother him anymore. Apollo had received Colton's letters and looked forward to receiving them every 6 months, but they stopped coming. Apollo cherished those letters, reading them daily, but couldn't bring himself to reply. One day, Iris saw Apollo holding a letter, tears streaming down his face. She went up to him and asked, "Why don't you go see him if you miss him? You know his address and it's not that far." Apollo replied, "I don't know what I'll say to him. He just left without saying anything to me. I don't even know if I'm still mad at him." Iris told him, "You'll know once you see him. Just go, I'll cover for you." Apollo smiled and hugged Iris, sniffling. First thing the next morning, Apollo left to see Colton. It was night when he arrived in the country. He held Colton's address in his hand, feeling a bit lost about where to go. He asked a little boy passing by if he knew the address, and the little boy immediately recognized who he was looking for. The boy led him straight to Colton's house, chattering excitedly about how kind Colton was to everyone and how much everyone loved him. Apollo smiled and was just itching to see him. When they got to Colton's door, Apollo knocked and a lady came out. Apollo turned confused to the boy and asked if he brought him to the right place, and the boy confirmed he did. Apollo murmured, "I didn't know Colton was married." The lady quickly clarified, No, I'm his neighbor. I just brought him some things from my farm to thank him for teaching my son for free. This is the least I can do to thank him. I was just leaving." She added, "You must be Colton's friend. You can come in and wait for him." Apollo replied that he was okay waiting outside. He thanked the little boy and the lady as they left. After waiting outside for a while, Apollo started to feel cold and regretted not accepting the offer to wait inside. He rubbed his body to warm himself up and approached Colton's door, trying to open it, but it was locked. At that moment, Colton was also approaching and saw a strange person trying to enter his house. He quickly rushed over and aggressively turned the person ready to launch a punch when he saw that it was Apollo. He slowly stepped back, shocked and speechless. "How did you get here?" Colton asked, his voice barely audible. Tears started rolling on Apollo's cheeks and he threw himself into Colton's arms. Apollo wrapped his arms tightly around Colton and asked, "Why did you leave without a word?" Colton apologized, "I'm sorry," and hugged him back. Apollo said, "I missed you so much," and Colton asked, "You're not angry with me?" Apollo replied, "I was, but my anger disappeared when I saw you." Colton wanted to say he missed Apollo too, but he remembered Rebecca's pregnancy. He gently pulled Apollo off, then said, "Congratulations." Apollo was confused and asked, "What for?" Colton replied, "I heard Rebecca was pregnant. She must have had the baby by now." Apollo then asked, "Is that why you stopped writing to me?" "I never did anything with her. The baby is someone else's and she has been kicked out." Colton started to explain, "Oh, I thought," but Apollo interrupted, "I'm offended you thought I'd do something with her. You know how much I disliked her." Colton tried to clarify, but Apollo cut him off with a quick kiss on the lips. Colton's eyes widened in surprise, a smile forming in the corner of his lips. Apollo shivered, rubbing his arms, and said, "I forgot how cold I was. Open the door." Colton nodded, quickly opening the door. They both went in. Apollo took a seat while Colton offered him a cup of tea, which he declined. Colton then headed to the kitchen to brew a cup for himself. The two hadn't seen each other in a long time, and an awkward tension filled the air. They exchanged awkward stares, not knowing what to say. Suddenly, Apollo broke the silence with a surprising question. "Do you want to make love tonight?" Colton spit out his tea in shock, his eyes fixed on Apollo, waiting for him to say it was just a joke, but Apollo remained silent, also waiting for an answer. After a while of silence, Apollo glanced at Colton's shirt then said, "You stained your shirt." Colton glanced down and muttered, "I'll be back," as he headed to his room to change. As he tried to close the door, Apollo followed him in and shut it behind them. Colton slowly backed away as Apollo advanced, his eyes locked on Colton's. They reached the bed, and Apollo sat. Apollo pushed Colton to lie on the bed, climbing the bed and positioning himself on top of Colton, smirking, asking, "Should we?" Colton held Apollo's waist and turned him over, Colton now on top of Apollo, and Colton asked, "Should we what?" Apollo pulled Colton by the neck and kissed him, parting Colton's lips with his. Colton kissed back, the kiss growing intense by the second, their tongues greeting each other. They were both inexperienced, as it was their first time, but they made it an unforgettable night. As they lay naked, wrapped in a blanket, they shared everything that happened in their lives since Colton's departure, before eventually drifting off to sleep. The next day, Colton took Apollo on a tour of the small country. As they strolled through the streets, Apollo noticed that everyone seemed to know Colton, and especially the young ladies kept smiling at him. Apollo remarked, "You are pretty popular here, I guess." Colton asked, "Are you jealous?" And Apollo replied, "Yes." Colton smiled and took Apollo's hand, intertwining their fingers. Apollo was taken aback, glancing around nervously. Colton reassured him, "Don't worry, The people here are open-minded. Apollo confessed that he had always longed to hold hands like this and explore the city freely, never thinking it possible. Colton replied, "We can now." After some days spent, Apollo had to leave. He wished he could stay forever, but he had to go back. Back at home, his parents scolded him, demanding to know where he had been. Apollo found the courage to reveal his truth. He was in love with Colton and refused to leave him, no matter what they say or do. Parents threatened to strip him of his title as crown prince, but Apollo didn't care. They wanted to show Apollo they weren't just bluffing, so they bestowed the title upon Princess Iris instead. Iris didn't want to be next ruler of the country, but for her brother's happiness, she accepted it. She had no desire in life, but her brother did, and she wanted him to freely do what he wanted. Apollo continued to travel back and forth to visit Colton, spending days in the small country. While Colton could visit Apollo, Apollo preferred going to Colton's place because he loved the freedom he felt there. He went so often that soon, everyone in the small town knew Apollo and his relationship with Colton. They were both fine with how their relationship was now, with Apollo even planning to permanently move to live with Colton.